Where's that bottle of scotch to keep back here? Isn't there usually like a bottle of scotch and a gun in one of these drawers?
Sometime I'll have to tell you about the print shop at my first museum. Had been moved there, went out and started to go through it. Nobody had ever curated the area. Opened up the guy's drawer. There was an old bottle of whiskey there. Didn't have the guts to open it, but we could have used it tonight. So tonight, Denver, we're talking about Ole Zinner and some tragic events that he was associated with. We are looking at Ole, born 1861 in Norway, and he and his parents and brothers and sisters all immigrated to Wisconsin. When he was 4 years of age, and eventually when he turned 22, he found his way, along with his brothers and sisters, out to North Dakota. Between 1883, 1884, and 1890, we really don't know exactly what Ole was doing. There isn't really records around that can tell us very much. We do know he got married in 1888 to a young lady named Mary Hoverson from Taylor, and then in 1890, he and his brother Paul obtained a land grant through the U.S. government for a section of land in what would eventually become Dunn County, and settled up there, basically starting a ranch with some farming associated with it as well. Ole and his brother Albert and brother Paul actually come to our attention now in 1890 in kind of a big way, in a very unfortunate incident. On April 15th, 1890, out at Ole's ranch, Ole's wife Mary is in the ranch house, and she goes to open the window, let some fresh air in, and throws up the sash, and she sees and hears her husband Ole and his brother Albert vigorously arguing about something. And Albert turns and sees her and basically ties into Mary, calling her, quote, a woman of easy virtue, in very plain language. And also, he accused her of using those same types of terms in regards to his wife. So, I guess to put it it sounds like Albert called her a whore, and she had been calling Albert's wife a whore.
So they were arguing outside, and then she overheard the argument, and then seemed to be stuck in the middle of it.
She got stuck in the middle of it, and later on, she gets stuck in the middle of it in a big way. So Albert ties into her about it, and she said, well, I actually heard it from Paul's wife, who's the third brother, and Albert leaves in a huff. Yeah, yes. I hadn't thought of it that way. So Albert says, well, you bring somebody forward who can prove that. I'm going to bring people I know, and we're going to see who's, apparently he basically said, we're going to see who the whore is here. And he leaves. And he goes and he gets his brother Paul and Paul's wife and a couple of other of their local neighbors, and he drags them all back to Ole's farm and is going to have it out with Ole's wife Mary. And they come back and they kind of all go up into the farmhouse. Ole's out in the barn at this point, and they go in, and Albert right away starts to tie into Mary and actually starts to mishandle her. He grabs her by the arm, shakes her around, and they go back and forth about what the allegations were. And by this time, Ole's come out of the barn, sees that people are there, and he starts to go to the house. And by the time he gets to the house, Albert is threatening to push Mary through the wall. Literally, that's what he says. And so they get into a bit of a tussle.
Guess they didn't live in a brick house.
No, this was not a brick house. Good point. Yeah, but either way, it would probably have been kind of hard on poor Mary. So they get into a bit of a tussle, physical tussle, because, of course, Albert is manhandling Ole's wife. And so he steps in between, and they start to grapple. and Ole contends that Albert, was actually choking him. And accounts differ at this point, but either Ole says he reaches to the plant stand. So this is probably like in their parlor.
Mm-hmm.
Reaches to the plant stand where everybody keeps their pistol, apparently. Although other accounts said that he actually pulled a pistol out of his pocket. But he does come up with a pistol in the middle of this clinch. One of the other witnesses, another Ole Olson, good Scandinavian name, he tries to intervene and he can't. They're so tightly clinched together. But Ole Zinner gets his hands on the pistol and it discharges and hits Albert. He hasn't killed Paul, it's Albert. Hits Albert under the armpit and instantaneously, which it seems like every time somebody's shot, they say it instantly killed him. Well, it didn't kill him quite fast enough because he did say, "I'm shot, boys," and then goes down. While all this is happening, of course, the whole room just kind of goes into a tumult. Mary runs out. Ole's brother Paul takes off. Ole Olson starts to take off. And another guy who's there, Knudsen, take off. They all run outside. And Ole steps out after them and actually fires 2 more shots as everybody's running away. Uh-huh. And he contends, and the shots apparently don't come close to anybody. He contends that he just wanted to scare everybody else away.
They were running away because they were scared already.
Exactly.
He had the scared thing down.
Yeah, actually he did,
You're not scared enough.
So, but he has killed his brother. And, well, no, I mean, it's kind of hard not to. I mean, these are tragic events. It's true, but it seems a little silly, I guess, in retrospect, how everybody reacts. Well, this is the thing, because right away, when this all transpires and everybody starts to run and what have you, when he fires a couple of shots, Ole Olson has a gun with him, and he turns around and he draws it on Ole Zinner and tells him to stop. And Ole Zinner gives Ole Olson his gun and tells him, he says, "I've got to go to Richardton and I got to telegraph the sheriff and tell him what happened." And basically that's what he did. He took himself down to Richardton, telegraphed the sheriff, waited for the sheriff there, and was taken into Dickinson and held at the Stark County Jail overnight. And then the next day, the local coroner convened a coroner's jury, and they went to the Olson Ranch and conducted their inquest. Coroner Ellison brought along Guy DeFrance, C.W. Livingston, and a guy named James Riley, who were sworn as his jurors. They view the body, which is typically what you do at a coroner's inquest. And then the jury adjourned to Richardton on April 17th to begin their deliberations. And their findings were as follows. And I'm going to quote this here, just because I love the legal language, right? An inquisition holden at Ole P. Zinner's residence 6 miles north of Richardton in the county of Stark, state of North Dakota, aforesaid on the 16th day of April, 1890, before P. Ellison, coroner of said county, upon the body of Albert Zinner, there lying dead, by the jurors whose names are here about to subscribe. The said jurors, upon their oaths, do say that he came to his death by a deadly weapon in the hands of Ole P. Zinner in his own house in self-defense. So basically, what the coroner's inquest comes up with is that after hearing all the testimony of all the people present, they did confirm that there was a struggle going on, and that Ole had been defending himself and defending his castle, and his plea of self-defense was accepted as valid. And so there was no recommendation for any further legal action against Ole.
Seems a little unfair, really. I mean, if he stepped in to stop Albert from beating his wife up, it's like it's wife defense, but it's self-defense. It's like, he beats my wife up, but, Well, I mean, okay.
Well, and of course, one of the features of crime reporting at this time period is it seems like the farther away the story goes, the wilder it gets. And it's one of the great things about the Chronicling America series project out of the Library of Congress, where they've digitized hundreds of different newspapers throughout the United States, is you can do a nationwide search by names. And so I actually came up with a few articles, one from Bismarck, actually, which isn't that far away, but then another one from the Gazette, the Warrenton Gazette out of North Carolina. And first, the Murder at Richardton article out of the Bismarck Weekly Tribune says Ole Zinner shoots his brother for alleged criminal relations with his wife. That's not said anywhere else, and especially not at the coroner's inquest. There's nothing along those lines. But it does say that this usually quiet and peaceable village was the scene of a terrible tragedy today. For some time past, Ole Zinner had suspected his brother Paul, well, it wasn't Paul, it was his brother Albert that he killed, had suspected his brother of criminal relations with his wife. But not until a few days ago was he fully convinced of his brother's perfidy. Today, Paul entered the house of his brother and made insulting remarks to Mrs. Zinner. Again, it's Albert, not Paul. A scuffle ensued, during which Ole shot and killed his brother instantly. The sentiment of the community is divided, but the majority hold the murderer blameless. Now, by the time he gets down to North Carolina, 7 days later, a sensational tragedy occurred at noon at the county residence of O.P. Zinner of Stark County, North Dakota. Albert Zinner entered the house of his brother Ole Zinner and insulted the latter's wife, whereupon O.P. Zinner grabbed a shotgun and literally blew his brother's head off. Albert died almost instantaneously, and the brother was arrested. A great crowd gathered at the jail at nightfall, and it was feared that the prisoner would be lynched before dawn. The sheriff was powerless to withstand the mob and had no opportunity to spirit his prisoner away. Never happened.
But he wasn't lynched, right?
He was not lynched. So, there was no account in the local newspaper about a mob at the jail or anything along those lines, and certainly he didn't blow his brother's head off. So, things were obviously a little slow in Warrenton, North Carolina that week, and they decided to juice up the story a little bit. But it is still a tragic story, brother killing his brother. Does it in there? Not completely. Abbeville, South Carolina, I should mention, the Abbeville Press and Banner carries basically the same story. They were convinced that poor Albert Zinner had his head blown off as well. But what's really kind of odd is the next week it's reported that fire destroyed the house of Mrs. Zinner, the widow of the late Albert Zinner, who was shot by his brother last week. Mrs. Zinner was absent at the time, visiting one of her neighbors, and all of her personal effects and the contents of the house were burned. She is now left in destitute circumstances. The fire is supposedly to be the work of an incendiary.
And that's pretty dark.
It is pretty dark. And that's the last thing you see related to that case. So this is the start of this odyssey of Ole Zinner. Kills his brother, and his poor sister-in-law, not ex-sister-in-law, I guess, has her house burned down around her, and we don't even know what happens to her.
So he alleged his brother was having an affair with his wife.
That's what the newspaper says, but the Dickinson press never alleges that. The account that comes out from the coroner's inquest is that the two women were basically saying the other was of easy virtue. Who was taking advantage of that? We don't know. Was it true? We don't know. But Albert's poor wife kind of left in the lurch, destitute, with a child too. So kind of a sad start to the whole story. But now we're gonna fast forward a little bit. Ole starts a meat market in the early 1890s in Taylor, which isn't too far from where his ranch is. We know for a fact that at least during part of his ranching career, he was raising Herefords, although I guess an Englishman sometimes called them Herefords.
Yeah, it would be pronounced Hereford. Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in a place where we called them Herefords, but they're red and white. So.
But we could put the picture of them on the stream.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
you see them.
Those who don't know what a Hereford or a Hereford looks like, they're attractive animals. I think. Nice color scheme. So
they look tasty.
Yeah, they truly do. They truly do. So he opens a meat market in Taylor, and then 4 years later opens another here in Dickinson on Barnes Street, which is today First Avenue West, probably in the vicinity of where the Oddfellows Hall is today, that first block just north of the Lard. He starts out in partnership with one man, and just a little over a year later, the partnership dissolves. He's involved in some other business ventures, and at least one of them, again, a partnership dissolves. And this starts to kind of feed into a pattern that we see talked about a lot more in a few years into the future from all of this, when the next part of Ole's saga occurs. So, as I said, he opens a meat market here in 1894, 1896. He and his wife, they build a house here in Dickinson. In the meantime, he's bought a couple, or I shouldn't say bought, he's made claims on a couple of more parcels of land for ranching. And in 1903, he sells a ranch that he had bought maybe about a year or so previously to a fellow named Benjamin Clemmy, Clemie. He's from a place called Cooperstown, North Dakota, which is from to the eastern part of the state. In July of 1903, he sells this one ranch, which was termed by the Bismarck Tribune to be one of the best ranches in the western part of North Dakota. A 1,600-acre ranch, which he sold for $16,000. And actually, the Dickinson Press reported that Ole had realized a $9 per acre profit over the price he had paid for the ranch just a year or two earlier. So it was a pretty shrewd deal for him. But along with the ranch sale, there are 400 Herefords that go along with it. But there's a contract, addition to the land sale, that basically says that Ole and Clemmy are going to own those 400 Herefords together. Clemmy to be responsible for taking care of them for 3 years as they grow and become marketable, and then they would be sold, and apparently the contract defined how much each one would profit from that. Sounds like a really good idea. We never see the actual contracts, but these contracts are the agreement is kind of important because that first winter that Clemmy has the ranch, that herd of Herefords suffers 44% fatalities through the winter. Not a really good thing for that business agreement they had, and Zeiner gets really kind of ticked off. They've lost 175 head, and Zeiner eventually starts legal proceedings against Benjamin Clemmy based on his contention that any reasonable rancher had more than enough hay that had been sold along with the ranch to see those cattle through the winter. And so basically he's filing a claim, what is called and I hope I pronounce this right considering my daughter's fiance is a lawyer, Replevin claim, Replevin. What it is, and this is the cool thing about these kind of projects, is you learn little things like this. A replevin claim is also known as a claim and delivery action, where most of the time, if you, for instance, somehow legally harm me, I would sue you for monetary damages. But a replevin claim is basically, yeah, you can sue for monetary damages, but what he mainly wants back, what Ole wants back, is he wants the cattle back because they're what's worth the money, as opposed to their worth as they're probably yearlings, I would guess, maybe by this time. So he files this claim to recover personal property that was wrongfully taken or detained, as they say, illegally. And Sheriff Goodall, who is the sheriff of Stark County, and as I said, the Zinner brothers, settled in what would become Dunn County. Dunn County is not organized for legal purposes at this time, so everything comes through Stark County. And so these papers that are filed, the claim and delivery of the remainder of the cattle herd, are served by Stark County Sheriff Goodall in early May of 1904. And during the visit to serve those papers to Clemmy's ranch, Goodall later testifies that Clemmy, quote, he talked some, he cried a little, and he swore a great deal, saying that, quote, Zinner was trying to break me. He'll never live to reap the benefit of it if he does. So there's a lot of bad blood that apparently is just boiling up between these two guys. Eventually, Clemmy files a countersuit against Zinner. We don't see the details on that, but it's just mentioned in the newspaper. And things kind of come to a head on Sunday, May 15th. That day, Sheriff Goodall is up at one of the Zinner, what's called the horse camp, which is nearby Clemmy's ranch, which he had bought from Zinner. They're up at the horse ranch, or the horse camp, I'm sorry, they call it, basically counting those cattle, confirming how many are left that are under this claim that Zinner has filed. And so Zinner's there, and two of his hired men, Knutson and Richard Fordyce, are there. They've been there since the Friday before, and this is a Sunday, I believe, working to tally the cattle. The sheriff had been up there kind of observing. He wasn't actually doing the tally, but he was there to kind of make sure that he could attest that the number they came up with would be legitimate and such. And he leaves about 8 o'clock in the morning after breakfast that Sunday on May 15th. On the way back to Dickinson, he stops by the Clemmy Ranch to offer the idea of a settlement between the two guys, because he knows that there's bad blood that's been building up between them. Clemmy's really not interested in a settlement. He's interested more so about bitching about Zinner and how unfair he's been to him and what have you. In fact, when the sheriff visits, he doesn't say, "Hi, sheriff, how you doing?" He's like, "Are you here to serve more papers?" Just the kind of thing that's going to build up a lot of goodwill with the local law enforcement guys. But so the sheriff stops. That remark happens, and then he continues on his way. And meanwhile, back at Zinner's horse camp land, Zinner and Fordyce, one of his hired man who's there, they start to plant a field of onions and potatoes. This is a fenced field. It's got barbed wire around it and such. So, there's a little farming going on too on this ranch land. And while they're planting the onions and potatoes, Fordyce walks down to the barn to do something to quiet the horses, he said. And from there, down by the barn, he looks back and he sees that Clemmy, a guy named Hartnell, and another fellow named Brown happens to be Clemmy's brother-in-law, are coming into the camp in a wagon box. Clemmy and Hartnell are up on the seat, and Brown's in back in the box itself. Fordyce reports at the coroner's inquest, and we'll get to who gets killed in a moment or two, that he left the barn as they're driving up. He goes up to the shack. They don't say it's not a farmhouse, but it's a shack, so it's just some kind of basic shelter. Not really sure what the nature of it is. But he goes up towards the shack to hang up his coat. And while he's there, he hears Clemmy say hello to Ole, Zinner, and very quickly an argument starts between the two guys. And while Fordyce is in the shack, he hears a shot, then comes out the door, and he sees Ole Zinner down on his hands and knees trying to get under the barbed wire fence. Clemmy is up on the seat of the wagon with a rifle, and he shoots Zinner as he's under the fence. Then he jumps down off the wagon, walks it to about 15 feet from Zinner, and shoots him again, blowing the top of his head off. Right away, Clemmy calls up to Fordyce, and he says, "You got to come down here. You're a witness to this." And of course, he's got his other two guys with him as well. And he said, he tells Fordyce that Zinner had tried to kill him. That was the first shot he apparently heard. And then he points and he goes, "Well, there's his gun." And it's a revolver that Fordyce says he's never seen before. Now, he's worked for Zinner for quite some time, has spent the weekend with him at that little shack, never saw anything in the shack except a shotgun. But Clemmy says, that's Zinner's gun. That's what he tried to shoot me with. Apparently, what happens, according to Clemmy, is that he shoots, misses, and starts advancing towards Clemmy and trips over a pick handle. I guess maybe they were supposedly using the pick handles to help create their rows when they were planting potatoes and onions. Trips over the pick handle. That's how he gets on the ground, and he gets in this kind of crab-like position to go underneath the barbed wire fence, because obviously he was going to run to the shack to get the shotgun. That's Clemmy's contention. To Clemmy's credit, I guess, because this is what people do. We saw this at our last True Crime Dickinson when Jasper Holtz is shot, the fellow who shot him goes to the sheriff right away. And when Zinner shoots his brother, he goes to the sheriff right away. Clemmy kills Ole Zinner, tells Fordyce he's a witness, and then says, "I got to go to the sheriff." And he leaves the ranch with Clemmy with Harold Brown. They go down to Taylor, where they telegraph the sheriff, and then they take the train to Dickinson. Not waiting for the sheriff, but they take the train to Dickinson for Clemmy to turn himself in, where he is lodged in the Stark County jail. And then he's moved, after the coroner's inquest, he's moved to Bismarck, where he stays until the trial. The coroner's inquest finding, quote, Ole P. Zinner came to his death on the 15th of May, 1904, by means of a leaden bullet fired from a gun in the hands of one B.K. Clemmy, with intent feloniously to kill, murder, said Ole P. Zinner, and Charles Hartnell and Harold Brown there and then aided and abetted the said B.K. Clemmy in the commission of said crime. So basically what the coroner's inquest comes back with is it says that Clemmy has murdered him, these two fellows with him were accessories, and they recommend that the three of them be held for trial. And that's basically what happens. Zinner is buried in Dickinson. They say that the funeral at the Congregational Church, the casket was a mass of beautiful, fragrant flowers, and he's interred in our cemetery, Dickinson Cemetery, which is not too far from here at the Museum Center. So Ole Zinner is dead. This is the second killing that he's been involved with. The case comes to trial in October of 1904. The session, of course, is held here in Dickinson. This, again, is when it's kind of a circuit court type arrangement where the judge will travel around to take court cases on. They start the trial. The complaint is actually read on October 17th. And then on October 18th, which is a Tuesday, all three of them enter not guilty pleas. And then they begin jury selection. This is where the trial gets really kind of interesting in a lot of ways. Number one, this is like the trial of the century for Dickinson, and the century is only 4 years old. Literally 3 weeks running, the newspaper is probably, of the column inches given to news items, probably 60 to 70% of it is the trial. And that first week is an account, rather laborious account, of jury selection. Now they start out by bringing in, the sheriff brings in 65 men, because you had to be a man to sit on a jury in North Dakota at that time. And the 65 men are examined, much like you would do it today. But unlike today, the Dickinson Press carried an account identifying each prospective juror, giving a little bit of background on them, and also the reason why they were excused or why they were picked. They go through 65 people, those 65 men, in about a day and a half. And they've got 8 people picked. Now, the reasons people are excused from jury duty, some of them know the principles. Primarily, they know Ole Zeiner, because he's been a merchant in Dickinson for quite some time. Yeah, they knew Ole Zeiner. And so they could be excused for cause. And then some others were excused. There were a few, at least, who did not have a really good grasp of English. And so it was felt probably not a great idea to try to ask them to try to understand all that was going to come out at the trial. So they were automatically excused as well. And then, of course, the prosecution and the defense are allowed a certain number of peremptory challenges where they can just basically say, I don't like the look of that guy. I don't want him. And the defense uses, I think, 17 of their 20, and the prosecution uses 7 of their 10 peremptory challenges.
It's got to be tough even a small town today. And Dickinson's not a small town by many regards. I mean, finding people to serve on the jury who don't know somebody else when it's really small. And
this time period, Dickinson is around 5,000 people. And if you think of average population, half of them are women, so they're not on the jury. And then of the half who are males, how many of them are actually of majority age? So it is a small pool. And what they end up doing and this is so quaint, this is so Americana, this is so early 19th or I should say early 20th century justice system. So they go through the first 65, and the judge says to the sheriff, he said, go find me 10 more. And he literally goes out on the street and looks for 10 more. But the sheriff's a prudent man. He knows how tough it's been to find just 8 out of the first 65. So he brings 15 back, and they go through all of those. And then he sent out to get another 10. And finally, I think by the time they get through the 6th of those last 10, they finally fill out a 12-man panel. But it takes them all the way to jury selection starts on the 18th and finally ends the morning of the 21st. And like I said, it's covered for its time period. It's covered in laborious detail in the Dickinson Press. What does that mean to us today as historians? It's really kind of cool because there's some folks in there that are mentioned that you may not find mention of them anywhere else in the historic record. But they've got a little paragraph in that issue of the Dickinson Press where we get an idea of what their occupation is, some of their background. Did they know Ole Zeiner? Did they not know him? Did they maybe dislike him? So we get a little bit of insight into the community through that. So I as tedious as it was to go through those jury selection pages. It really is a really cool local history resource. So they finish jury selection, and then the state begins its case right away on Friday, October 21st. And the first of what would be 47 witnesses are called. And you laugh, as well you should. That was my quick count. I went through the different phases of the trial.
I've been to a lot of agricultural areas in these states, and like on any given day, your chance of passing 47 people is pretty low, especially if you're out in the actual, the fields, the worked areas. Yeah. Unless there was a band sort of, marching nearby or something else.
Yeah, it does sound really kind of weird that you'd get that many, but many of them actually come in towards the end of the two cases, both the state's and the defense cases. There are a bunch who are there as character witnesses. But then there's some expert witnesses. Two of the doctors are called who actually had conducted the autopsy. One of the first people to be called is actually A.M. Pomeroy, who is a local photographer who went out to the murder site and took photographs. Zeiner's corpse was still there. He had been covered with something overnight, but they go out there the next day. And this, I was kind of impressed in 1904 that they're thinking about doing photographs of the crime scene. And then also taking measurements and what have you. And so Pomeroy, when he's there to talk about the photographs, he's also got his drawings of where everybody was located, where the wagon was, supposedly, of course the wagon's not there, but where Zeiner was and where the pistol was found, the Zeiner pistol, I call it, allegedly, and such. But the defense objects. Can't have that in there because Pomeroy's not a surveyor. And the defense does this type of thing all along, just anything to kind of throw a little wrench into the prosecution's case. They'll object. Well, eventually they do get a plat of the site, which a lot of it's got to be based on what Pomeroy saw himself, but a legitimate surveyor actually went out and did the drawings, and they had to accept that. So Pomeroy starts out, and that happens. Then Dr. George Perkins, and then Dr. H.A. Davis are both called. They had, ironically, they had done the autopsy, but Perkins also, when he was out there for the autopsy, he kind of made a sketch of the grounds himself. And the prosecution tries to put that one into, and the defense objects. And of course, well, he's a doctor; he's not a surveyor. So that the first two times to try to get a plat of the crime scene are objected to, and the objections are upheld. But they do talk about the autopsy and the cause of death. Interestingly enough, I mean, I have to talk about the wound. The first wound is to the left shoulder of Zeiner, and it's caused by a rifle bullet which, quote, passed inward and upward. Now, the way Fordyce explains it, Zeiner's crawling under the barbed wire when he's first hit, and Clemmy's up on the wagon box. And the bullet hits him in the shoulder and then travels at an upward angle, something less than 45 degrees to the plane of the back, crushing parts of the spinal column and severing the spinal cord. And the shot was extracted from the right shoulder, just beneath the skin. They offer the bullet, enter the bullet into evidence, and again, the defense objects, but they're overruled in that case. Perkins, Dr. Perkins, who helped with the autopsy, says that wound would have caused, quote, instant death, and no movements other than involuntary could have followed. Well, we already have Fordyce, who talked at the coroner's inquest, that Ziner is crawling, he gets shot, he's still crawling, and Clemmy shoots him a second time. So, I mean, there's kind of a little bit of a, who do you believe there? Well, I guess you think you want to believe Fordyce because he saw it. Perkins is just kind of assuming, or what have you, on based on the physical evidence, that there would be nothing really except involuntary movement. He wouldn't have still been moving. But Clemmy's contention when he comes up for testimony is that he was convinced that Ziner was on his way to the shack to get another gun, and he feared for his life, and that's why he shot him.
Shot him again.
Well, Clemmy doesn't remember shooting him a second time. That one he just doesn't remember it. But Richard Fordyce, again, he talks about what he saw. He says, upon going to the door, he saw Clemmy standing in or on the wagon, raised his rifle and shoot. He saw Ziner on his hands and knees coming towards the shack as Clemmy shot. Ziner fell under the wire fence, had he been crawling under it, and did not see him move again. And then he saw Clemmy jump down from the wagon and saw him go west 20 feet and north 5 feet to within 15 feet of Ziner and shoot again. Clemmy tells Fordyce that Ziner tried to kill him and points to the Ziner pistol, which Fordyce says, again, he'd never seen it before. Basically, the other hired man, Harry Knudsen, who was there that day, backs up Fordyce's testimony for the most part. And then, as the prosecution case continues, they basically take a recess the third day of the trial because the judge wants the jury to go visit the scene of the crime. That sounds very Columbo-ish type thing. I guess maybe I didn't really expect to see it in a 1904 trial, but this gives the defense a chance to object again. Anything that they can object to in terms of slowing the prosecution's case down, they do. But that visit does give the chance for the prosecution to send along a real surveyor, a professional surveyor, and that's where they finally get a plat of the murder scene admitted into evidence. Then, when they come back from that visit on Monday the 24th, so this is a week into the trial, when they have the crime scene visit. On that Tuesday, the state continues their case, and they have several witnesses testifying to having heard Clemmy making threats against Ziner at various times. And again, it all goes back to this replevin claim that Ziner had filed against Clemmy to try to get the Herefords back. But there's some accounts, that with if you're imaginative, when they do the dash, I'm pretty sure one of the things is that Clemmy says is, I'm going to kill that Norwegian son of a bitch. Doesn't make any sense any other way to read it, but the newspaper's a little squawky about that type of thing. Won't put it exactly in.
Well, we're not so squawky.
We're not so squawky about it.
It's all right. It's after 9 o'clock.
That's right. It's after 9 o'clock. So they do a little bit along those lines, trying to create a basis for threats made by Clemmy, and then they call Charles Hartnell, who actually is the one of the two hired men who was with Clemmy. They call him basically as a hostile witness to confirm the identity of the rifle that fired the fatal shot. And that gives them a chance to bring him into the case. Whereas, as accused, he wouldn't necessarily have to take the stand. But they're bringing him in as a witness about something that's not going to affect his part of the case, supposedly. So they do bring him in that way. Then the defense starts their case on Wednesday, October 26th. Clemmy is the first witness. He decides to take the stand in his own defense. And he recounts events leading up to the killings. He recounts a somewhat longer conversation with Ole than the prosecution witness Fordyce heard, although Fordyce, was in the shack at the time and didn't hear too much beyond hello. Zinner basically said he was arguing, Clemmy basically says he was arguing with Zinner over the cattle, and he testifies that Zinner got agitated and cursed. And now this one I couldn't figure out, but Zinner cursed Clemmy, and it was some 6-word phrase, and I haven't been able to figure out what the heck that would be. I've gotten pretty inventive in my mind, but not really sure that I could offer a really good translation of those dash, 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 dash. But he did say, if you don't get out of here, I'll shoot you, supposedly, Zinner says to Clemmy. And that's when he pulled a pistol and, quote, blazed away from about 15 feet away from Clemmy. When Zinner saw Clemmy take his gun, he stumbled over a pick handle and partially fell. This must be when he loses his pistol. And then Clemmy says, hold on there. And then Zinner starts running for the shack. This completely contradicts Fordyce's testimony, both at the inquest and earlier in the state's case. When asked why he fired at Zinner, Clemmy said that Zinner had threatened to kill him and he had been told to look out for him, that he'd killed his own brother and had tried to kill another man, maybe at the depot was the story. Nobody's ever confirmed that. And he'd been told that Zinner was of a bad character and felt that if he got to the shack, he'd get a gun and he would do Clemmy bodily harm. But then he had no recollection of all of firing the second shot.
Which blew the top of his head off.
Blew the top of his head off. The doctors testify that parts of the skull and brain matter were found up to 22 feet away from where the body lay. I
can imagine why he might have blocked that out.
I guess, yeah. It might have been just.
It's not like he had much to hide, really, with that shot, did he? I mean, it's like, I don't remember that one. Well, I suppose it would look bad if he. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I guess the other part of what he could have said, if they made a big deal about it, was that, well, if you look at the autopsy report, the doctor said the first shot killed him instantaneously. So, what are you going to do? Charge him with abuse of a corpse? I don't even know if that was a statute in North Dakota at the time. Clemmy is then cross-examined by L.A. Simpson. He's he's acting as state's attorney. We don't have district attorneys. We have state's attorneys here, so it's a little different from where I grew up. But Simpson actually is one of the founders of what is the Makoff and Kellogg law firm today. Was also a state senator, fairly well known, and I did find at one point he was disbarred, which I thought was kind of interesting, but not related to this trial. When Simpson cross-examined Clemmy, he did get Clemmy to admit that he had been fined $100 for assault and battery in Cooperstown in May of 1903 before moving out to Dickinson. And then Clemmy denies, and then admits that he had to pay a $25 fine for assault and battery in Cooperstown in September of 1901. And then Clemmy couldn't say if he did or did not pay a $10 fine for assault and battery in April of 1896 in Griggs County, but he wouldn't swear that he hadn't. Might have, might not have, but it was only $10, so what the heck. Then Simpson takes on Clemmy over claims that he bought a pistol in St. Paul. Clemmy makes denials about the pistol, which seems to indicate that the state's attorney had questions based on other testimony about the pistol, probably from a pre-trial deposition. One of the things that becomes very clear as you see this long list of witnesses grow is that both sides have done a lot of legwork. As I said earlier, there's a bunch of people who come forward on both sides as character witnesses. Some who talked about Zinner being very problematic and a hard man to get along with, and others talking about these types of activities, the assault and battery and what have you from Clemmy. And we'll come back to the pistol part in a little bit, and I think it's kind of interesting in a really kind of cool way because it gives another neat twist to this thing. Then after Clemmy gets off the stand, Hartnell is called again. He testifies to what was apparently a private conversation he once had with Zinner, in which Zinner said, quote, "Clemmy makes me angry enough to kill him." Of course, Hartnell is also, he's charged as an accessory to this crime. So, I mean, take that with a grain of salt. Hartnell said that when Zinner made that remark to him, he said back, "I would not do that. It would not be right." You know, wow. Powerful statement by Hartnell, to which Zinner replies, quote, "Sometimes a man needs it." So if you believe Hartnell, Zinner had it in for Clemmy. I'm not sure that I necessarily believe him or not, but I'm not on the jury. Hartnell then recounts the conversation right before the shooting, and this is more detail than Clemmy gave us. Clemmy says, "Good morning, Ole," as they drive up, and Zinner says, "Hello." Clemmy then said he thought he ought to have money for wintering the steers who he lost 44% of the herd, I guess. And Zinner rises up then saying, "I'll kill you, goddamn you." And at that, Hartnell said he got down in the wagon. He ducked back into the wagon box to escape Zinner's shot. He doesn't say that he sees Zinner pull a pistol, but he ducks back into the window, into the wagon box to avoid the shot. And so when he ducks back down into the wagon box, he hears Zinner's shot and then two more shots. But he did not swear that he saw the rifle in Clemmy's hands, even though he'd been up on the wagon box with Clemmy where the rifle was. But he won't swear that he saw it in Clemmy's hands. When Hartnell got up after the shooting stopped, he saw Zinner was laying under the fence and Clemmy was just getting down from the wagon. Well, we know from Fordyce's testimony that Clemmy got down from the wagon, immediately walked over, and that's when he fired the second shot. Clemmy doesn't deny that because he doesn't remember firing the second shot. So all we really have is Fordyce's version of events. Take that for what it says. Hartnell, as I said, was on the wagon box when they stopped. When cross-examined, he said Zinner was abreast of the horses and some 6 feet north of the wagon. Again, that contradicts Fordyce because the wagon's obviously on the path side of the barbed wire fence. Zinner is in the field to begin with and has to climb under the fence to get where he's going, and that's when he's shot. So I don't think you can take Hartnell's testimony as being terribly accurate if you believe Fordyce. Then they examine the defense calls Harold Brown. This is the other hired man that Clemmy had with him that morning. He's Clemmy's brother-in-law. He had been brother of Clemmy's late wife. He had been in the wagon box on the way there. He heard the conversation between Clemmy and Zinner, heard Zinner get angry and say, "Get off from there or I'll kill you," and then saw Zinner, quote, rising with a revolver in hand and ducked his head and dropped to the floor of the wagon. You see Zinner bring a pistol up. He ducks down into the wagon for safety, so he doesn't actually see Zinner make the shot, but he's got the pistol in his hands. And he denied that he had made a statement in Simpson's office to Sheriff Goodall that he did not know anything about who did the shooting on May 15th. Said he never said that. I believe Goodall later is called as a rebuttal witness and basically said, well, yeah, he did say that. So Harold Brown's testimony is I think somewhat suspect. And then we bring a new name into the case, and this is kind of interesting. Harold Brown says he doesn't know anything about Myrtle Young or about a pistol that Clemmy bought in St. Paul. The story goes, and there are other witnesses from the prosecution side, including Mrs. T.S. Beard, who testify to seeing Clemmy in St. Paul. Mrs. Beard and her husband, actually, who had been introduced to Clemmy prior to the Zinner sale of the ranch. So she knew the man. She testified that she saw him at a specific hotel in St. Paul. They spoke, and Zinner basically made mention that he had got himself a pistol because there was the possibility that Myrtle Young's husband might be looking for him. Later on, it comes out from a hotel clerk from that hotel, and they bring in the registry that there it is, B.K. Clemmy and wife registered on that date. Clemmy denies ever being in that hotel, ever buying the pistol, or knowing Myrtle Young. And that starts to come out through the prosecution's rebuttal witnesses. And that brings us, the state's rebuttal began on Friday, October 28th. The first rebuttal witness is Sheriff Goodall. He comes in and he identifies State's Exhibit L, which I call the Ziner pistol. The pistol was found on the ground 30 feet from where Ziner was allegedly fired, 30 feet from where Ziner allegedly fired to start the altercation. Pomeroy indicated that that spot, 30 feet away, was from where the sheriff picked up the pistol when he came to examine the ground. This is the pistol that Fordyce and Knutson, Ziner's hired men, had never seen. Then they bring up another rebuttal witness, a guy named A.C. Mitchell, who had worked for Clemmy sometime. He was also one of the witnesses to the St. Paul bought pistol and the whole Myrtle Young incident at the hotel. And he mentions that a Harold Brown, back at Clemmy's place after St. Paul, was actually hammering small nails into a wooden box using the butt of that pistol.
I've seen YouTube videos like that.
Mm-hmm.
They don't end well.
Yeah. Well, this one, it shouldn't have ended well because there are marks on the pistol from this hammering. Sheriff Goodall, who found the pistol and has had it in his possession as a material exhibit in the case, testifies to that fact. But Clemmy continually, when they come back for the rebuttal from the defense, just categorically denies anything to do with that pistol. His pistol was a different pistol. I think that whole thing with the gun, the sheriff actually, when he recovered the gun, he actually put a scratch mark on it to identify it so that he could have a chain of evidence. And it was seen in the prosecutor's office. The sheriff had brought it by. So there's been I think a pretty good chain of evidence on this pistol, but Clemmy just simply denies it. And that's when they bring in the room clerk from the Metropolitan Hotel in St. Paul. And then they get to the character witnesses. And the state brings in witnesses to talk about Clemmy's truth and veracity in general. And these witnesses are from Cooperstown, where he was from. And they also, one of the witnesses is State Senator Maynard Crane, who said he wouldn't believe Clemmy under oath. The reason Crane says he's was willing to be involved with the trial is he is there for young Harold Brown, constituent of his from that he represents, and didn't think Brown had anything to do with this. That's why he stepped forward and agreed to be a witness for the prosecution against Clemmy's character. So I think that's a fairly significant type of a witness, particularly when the state senator said that he wouldn't believe Clemmy even under oath. Then they bring a few other witnesses in, including Alphonse Hilliard, Mayor Daniel Manning, A.T. Crowell, and George Sineur. These are all members. In fact, Dan Manning's right here behind us here, first mayor of Dickinson. And the other fellows along with him, they are all on the city council at the first city council
So he was mayor from 1900 to 1908, it says there.
Yes, correct. And they basically come and talk in support of Zeiner's character. And they freely admit that, Ole wasn't always the most pleasant man, but their dealings with him.
Look, he didn't have his sister-in-law come be a
Well,
character.
exactly. Well, she was burned out of her house. We don't know where she ended up going. Oh, it's sad.
Certainly sad.
Yes,
That's
truly was.
Yep.
But so there's those character witnesses come forward, and then Mrs. Beard, again, as I had mentioned, she's talking about the hotel in St. Paul as well. And then the defense gets to do what's called the SIR rebuttal, to kind of rebut the rebuttal witnesses from the state. And that starts on Monday the 31st. So we're getting, pretty closely into the trial here. In that SIR rebuttal, Clemmy is called back to the stand. And these 47 witnesses, there's probably about 10 of them that are recalled, not just once, but 2 and 3 times, to specifically address things that have come out in earlier direct examination. This is not the kind of progress of witnesses that, you're used to from growing up with, like, Perry Mason. They lay everything out nice and easily and chronologically and this, that, and the other thing. But it almost, as you read the testimony, and it's not a transcription, but as you read the account of the trial, you almost think, oh, prosecution's saying, get the sheriff back in here. We need to get him on this issue that came up from the other side. So sheriff is back again in this, and this is probably, he's probably called about 4 or 5 times to the stand. But Clemmy testifies that he had never seen or owned the Zeiner gun. He had never seen it before the day of the shooting. He never introduced a woman to Mrs. Beard as his wife. Who is Myrtle Young? He doesn't know. Harold Brown testifies to support Clemmy on the Zeiner gun issue. The defense rests again. And there's a little bit of testimony regarding the placement of the body and to confirm that the body had not been moved overnight before the coroner's inquest was there. It's really, I think, just a little housekeeping type issue. And then the defense rests, prosecution rests, and they're ready to send the case to the jury. 12 good men and true. And so on Tuesday, November 1st, the judge reads the instructions to the jury, which the Dickinson press, I swear it's a verbatim accounting of the instructions to the jury. And the instructions took him an hour and a quarter to convey to the jury.
I sympathize.
Yeah. So the jury gets their instructions on Tuesday, and they start deliberations the next day because obviously the judge has used up the rest of that day. And so the jury gets the case on Wednesday the 2nd. They deliberate for 2 hours, just 45 minutes more than what it took to get the jury instructions. And they come back and they acquit Benjamin Clemmy of killing Ole Zeiner feloniously. It was a self-defense case. Clear and simple. Even the first ballot was 11-1. So this jury had their mind made up pretty quickly, and I don't see why they did. I would have gone the other way for sure. Following the verdict, state's attorney Campbell, who was assisting Simpson, moves to dismiss the charges against Brown and Hartel. Obviously, as accessories, if there's no homicide conviction, it's pointless to charge them as accessories, so they're released. The case is estimated to have cost $2,000 to $3,000 to try in 1904. That's a chunk of change. But, the really good thing is this occurs technically in the unorganized area of what is now Dunn County. So Dunn County is not organized. Stark County isn't going to pay for it. The state has to pay for the trial. So that's the end of the trial. It's not the end of the story. Don't you want to know what happens next? Don't you want to?
I would like to know what happens next, especially to the major players in this story.
Well, Ole is still dead. That we know. But Clemmy continues to ranch, and Hartel is his continues on as his ranch hand. August of 1905, they are out doing some work in one of the fields, and before they go out to work in the field, Clemmy tells Hartel, he said, grab the shotgun. My mom saw some chickens, meaning prairie chickens, out along the field.
Dangerous chickens.
And if we see them, we want to get them so we can have them for dinner. So Hartel grabs a shotgun, and they're going along working. And somehow, and they aren't really clear about this in the account, but he's got an implement like a rake or something like that with him, and he's got kind of the shotgun resting across it like this as he's walking along. And Ben Clemmy's like, "There's some chickens," and Hartel starts to move forward, slips, falls, the gun discharges, and he shoots Ben Clemmy in the back and kills him instantly. Divine retribution? Who's to say?
Did they eat him? And they were going to eat,
they were going to eat the chickens,
they had to shoot dinner. And
this is true. Clemmy and his young son and are living with his mother, and she testifies at the coroner's inquest that he and Hartel were really very, very good friends, and they were like brothers. And
but not like the previous brothers we had in our story.
No. You notice how their mother, Mrs. Zeiner's, nowhere around. We don't know what's going on there, but they do come back with a verdict of an accidental death for Clemmy. And that almost ends the story of Ole Zeiner. Almost. Because I came across this little gem from Prairie Public Radio. They do a terrific job of finding stuff. A guy named Stan Stelzer wrote this up. And I think probably the easiest way is to use their words for this. I'm giving them full credit. So, the haunting of a Butte in western North Dakota. Dunn Center, North Dakota, Dateline. There's a Butte in western North Dakota that some say is more than just dirt and grass and rock. It has history, old-timers say, of being haunted. Haunted Butte? Yes, hard to believe, but the story persists. The Butte, known as Zinner's Butte, is on the ranch of Marvin Sins in Dunn County. Sins was a teenager when he first saw something spooky on that butte, just a little west of the ranch house. Quote, and we were at our neighbors to the east here, and I suppose it was about 10 o'clock at night, and we left and we saw a light up on the butte. And we had wheat. We stored wheat up there. We had some kind of bins we'd put together, and my dad thought somebody was up there robbing us because we saw a light up there. And we drove up there and there was nothing to see. So I guess that was my only encounter with it. But there are other people who have seen it too. Some say the explanation of this is simple. It's just headlights shining off the butte from cars passing on a nearby road. Or it could be the moon shining off the rocks. But others have a more chilling tale. They say the light is a lantern carried by the ghost of Ole Zeiner, who was shot and killed near the butte by another man over a property dispute. An argument that led to murder more than 100 years ago. And as the story goes, the ghost of Ole Zeiner has been out on the butte with a lantern, searching for his head, which was blown away in the shooting. You know, he was going across the top of the butte from north to south, I guess, with that lantern. That was the way the story went that they told, and it's kind of spooky. Sign says the light hasn't been seen for years. Well, I tell you, it hasn't happened in the last few years, and most of the old-timers that did know about it are gone. But some in Dunn County still remember, and wonder if the light on Zinner's Butte really is a ghostly lantern.
How do they know it's Ole Zinner if it hasn't got a head?
Well, remember...
He didn't have a lantern either.
This is true, but Ole did. Ole is the one person who actually got his head partially blown off in this thing. So give him credit for that, I guess. But that's the saga of Ole Zinner and all these unfortunate things that happened to him.
Well, he did shoot his own brother as well, so it's not like that was unfortunate for somebody else.
This is true. Although,
and probably burned his sister-in-law's house down.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's just cold. That's just really cold. I just never really thought of Norwegians that way.
Not very creative with names, Ole Olsen, Knudsen. Like...
Yes, that's true. So
this was
yeah, that's the Zinner story. Zinner, however I pronounce it both ways, kind of interchangeably. But maybe we'll get a Norwegian to call in and tell us what's the real way to pronounce it. But
some fiery people.
Truly, really interesting story. When I started doing this type of research, it was just really easy to start to zone in by doing things like searching for murder in the chronicling American newspapers. And so Ziner's name comes up for the 1890 case. And I thought, well, that's kind of, it's sad he caught his brother and this, that, and the other thing. And then it shows up again. Maybe a couple of weeks later, I was doing some more searching, and I'm like, that name sounds really familiar. And by gosh. But probably the hardest thing was just wading through the account of the jury selection and the testimony, which was not a transcription. It's interesting that the Bismarck Tribune was actually fairly friendly to the press. There are some other papers that aren't. And some of it may be political, maybe kind of party affiliations where they kind of stink on each other. But the Bismarck paper was very complimentary of the press's coverage of the trial. And it was several days, obviously, a couple of weeks plus worth of time, and they had somebody in the courtroom all the time. Fairly impressive thing, I think, for a small local newspaper to do at that time. Pretty interesting.
Pretty big story, though.
Huge story.
I mean, I don't know. Shootings I don't recall there's been one since I've been here in a few years, and it seems like there were quite a few around the turn of the century. So.
Yeah, it wasn't uncommon. Yeah, these are ranchers. They're not necessarily cowboys, but they're like one step from. So it's kind of interesting. It's funny, though, because there's other things that are mentioned in the course of the trial that Clemmy talks about, that there's a rumor that Zinner had tried to shoot another man, that it might have happened down at the depot. And you do a search for that, which should be fairly easy to find, and there's no mention of that. And then there's other witnesses who said that Clemmy once claimed that he had shot a man in Montana, killed a man in Montana, and he was happy to do it again, and he'd do it to Ole Zinner if he had a chance. But you can't verify those types of things either. It's kind of perplexing. But it's probably like the ghost of Ziner's Butte. It's just kind of legend that grew up around those guys. But it sounds like neither one of them were very pleasant individuals. So I'm not sure what we might have lost overall there. But it was an interesting case to research. It was a lot of fun. And I know more about Ole Zinner now than I ever thought I would.
So what's next? Do you have another case?
There are a couple of different ones that could develop. We get the basic facts, but what really takes the time is to try to put the background to them and try to find a good hook along those lines. You know, the fact that Jasper Holtz, in our first case, actually had been involved in the Teddy Roosevelt boat thief incident, although, you know, very tangentially, is that the word I'm looking for? It's 9:30. My mouth's not working too well anymore. But so little things like that are the hooks that I think that make the stories interesting. There are some. There's a really convoluted case. Yeah, that kind of lends itself. It's a case of a claimant to a large sum of money related to a ranching family, and someone, you know, claims that this person is who he is, but he doesn't remember who he is, and then before they even get to the courts for like the second or third time to try to decide, the guy's parents, his alleged parents, where the money would come from, are killed by a farmhand who eventually goes insane and dies in an institution. There's some cool, interesting stuff like that. So, but you know, give me a few weeks and I'll start to plug along. This is a lot of fun to do.
Well, hopefully people will have enjoyed the story, and of course, all based on real people. Well, not based on real people. It is real people.
We don't have a lot of photographic evidence, folks.
That guy was made up, wasn't he? But like, he might not have been a real person. But other than that.
But Myrtle Young was probably real, even though Clemmy denies. Deny. Oh.
But, so we will probably do one of these again. Maybe we'll sit in a different corner. I don't know. Maybe one of the comfy chairs. That'd be quite nice. But
I don't know. If we started at 8 o'clock, by about 8:30, I maybe just.
Yeah. So if you've enjoyed this, we are open at the museum now. We open.
That's right.
Do we have Monday this week or last week?
It was Monday. This last Monday. So this is the end of our first full week in operation since the shutdown.
Yeah. And we put plexiglass up in the shops, as a lot of places are doing. We have plexiglass over our player piano as well. So we had a big plexi order, and so the player piano is a part of the exhibit now.
You can actually see the action of the interior of the piano when it's played. It's really kind of cool.
Yeah, you can bang on Alison's door and get her to come out and play it for you.
You
didn't hear that from me. You heard it from Bob.
Well, we figured, you know, it's part of that museum staff exercise program.
You don't even have to bang on the door; just bang on the desk. Anyway. Yes. So there's a few new things to see, and if you haven't been in for a while, there's some things on the dinosaur side, of course, that I'm involved in. But we're open Monday through Saturday. We're still on the sort of winter hours, I think, until
the Tuesday after Memorial Day, we will start our 7-day-a-week operation. So it would be Monday through Saturday, 9 to 5, and then Sundays are noon to 5.
Yeah. We don't have the touch items available at the moment. So, but everything else, the exhibits are open. So, come on by and see what's going on at the museum, and we'll do some more of these things. I think as we're slowly getting a better grip on the technology, we'll be able to do more sort of video things and stuff like that. So, anything else to add?
Well, I'm looking forward to when we, see true crime dinosaurs. Because I know that you've got dinosaurs that have, they have a trace of being attacked by others. So
that sounds like a challenge. Sounds like maybe not the next one. We'll see. True crime dinosaurs. I could handle that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again, and good night.
Hope you enjoyed it.